The topic of this conversation is scaling engineering teams through hypergrowth. And so Naveen is the head of product engineering at Pinterest, and he was one of the earliest engineers with Pinterest, and he helped guide the team through the transition to a mobile-centric program. And so he helped transition their mobile app to 20 to 80% of users. And so Naveen's an entrepreneur at heart, and he invests and advises startups in his spare time. So with that, let's please, the fun fact is Naveen Gavini actually got the most amount of likes on LinkedIn when we were talking about the speakers, so that's kind of fun. But let's please give Naveen a huge round of applause as he comes on up.
All right, all those LinkedIn likes, a lot of pressure. Okay, so thanks for joining for this talk. This is a topic that I've spent the last 7 years working through, and I could talk for days on end about this topic, but for the sake of this, I've consolidated the talk to about 15 minutes and really wanted to leave you with just about 6 actionable tips that you can walk away from and hopefully take to your teams to think about. Okay, so I wanted to start off with this question of like, what is hypergrowth? And I think that if you look back 10 to 15 years, this term probably didn't even exist, right? And so if you look at our timeline of internet companies, right, over the past 20 to 25 years, the rate at which these companies have grown has gotten much, much quicker, right? And so if you think back to that 95 era of the companies in that realm, the rate at which it took them to get to 100 million users was a lot slower than the companies in the 2010 era, right? They got there much, much quicker. And I think this is in part to a lot of things. I think that the rate at which technology is evolving, the spread of the internet, the spread of connected devices, we all have a device in our pockets today, really allow these new age companies to grow users much, much quicker. And also, we have far superior infrastructure today than we ever had before. So you could build amazing things with much smaller teams than we needed in the past. But with this, with the growing scale and how fast you have to grow today, comes the need to build your teams just as fast. And so that's what today's talk is all about. How do you do that effectively? So just like quick historical thing, this is Pinterest when I joined. This is 7 years ago, 2012. We all fit on our staircase, and every 6 months, 6 to 12 months, this was the evolution. And so I've been so lucky at Pinterest. I've worn so many different hats, been in a lot of different teams, and played a leadership role in really scaling out our engineering team. And when you do this through hypergrowth, my 7-year journey at Pinterest actually feels kind of like 70 years, the 10x startup multiplier. And so you learn a lot during that. And so hopefully today I'll share some of the lessons of things we got right, but also things that we screwed up terribly. So hopefully you don't have to do the same thing. Okay, so when we think about scaling, there's 2 parts to me that are really important. The first is building the team, and the second is really evolving and thinking about how you scale, how you work, right? So the first I want to start with is just how do you think about building the team? And so this topic covers things like hiring, retaining talent, and leadership development. So I want to start out, today's market is super competitive. You've got these large companies, you've got the Hoolies of the world competing against the Pied Pipers, and we're all in a battle for, the best talent, right? And it's really, really hard when you're scaling because you want to maintain that talent bar and attract the very best talent you can. So the first tip I have, and it sounds super basic, but we'll dive into it, is really understanding your recruiting funnel and always evolve your interview process. So this is my first tip. And we'll take a simple example. This is like a very simple funnel. You hopefully have a more complex funnel at your company, but just really drawing this out and understanding it in detail. And not just at the aggregate level, but understanding it across role, across discipline, across team is incredibly important. And making sure that this funnel is healthy and you're seeing the numbers that you want as you continue to grow and scale. At Pinterest, over the years, when we've seen a slowdown in hiring across the board or in a specific role or a specific team, it's always because we've lost sight of the funnel. We stopped looking at it, or we just continue to do what we were doing. And keeping an eye on this, of how you're doing week over week, allows you to actually rapidly adjust the tactics that you're taking to make sure that the funnel's in a healthy state. So today, we actually have a few people that are dedicated to looking at this daily and sending out updates. They send alerts or emails when things are not looking right, when there's large changes, either positive or negative. And the important part is, too, is once a candidate gets through the funnel and joins, it's also important to track their performance after. So we track 6 to 12 months after how they're doing, and we actually go back and modify our interview process accordingly based on what we find of how they're performing in their job. So, the funnel's important, but who's going through the funnel is also really important, who you hire. So you might read a lot about the differences between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. I think when you're growing and you're scaling very quickly, hiring people with a growth mindset is really important. People that treat failure as a learning opportunity. The same thing boils down to skill sets. Early to mid-stage companies, it's incredible to find people that have this generalist mindset, this general skill set, because the needs of the business require people to morph into different roles and take on different tasks. The flexibility is a must. And so I think when you're larger in scale, it's easier to hire folks that are specialized at ML, specialized at iOS, or a certain skill that's needed. Okay. And then, when you look at your funnel, it's also really easy to make changes to your interview process. And so by seeing how the funnel is performing. And so, we've made changes over the years of how we do interviews. We've done take-home interviews. We've done whiteboarding interviews, pair programming interviews. We've tried a lot of different things based on how we're seeing the funnel is doing. And so I wanted to share one really recent provocative example that I've been sharing with folks. And so this is recent, but for us, we looked at our funnel and we said hey, we're spending such a disproportionate amount of time at the top of the funnel. And we said hey, we're limited actually not by any other reason, but our engineers' time in conducting interviews. And so when you conduct an interview, you're making a trade-off of that engineer spending time interviewing somebody or doing work for the business, right? And so we looked at this and we said hey, how do we weigh this trade-off, right? And so we recently teamed up with a company called Carrot. I don't know if folks are familiar with Carrot, but if you aren't familiar with Carrot, it's an amazing company. They do interviews as a service. So they have engineers at Carrot that actually interview people for you. And they provide an amazing candidate experience. So candidates actually can interview at night. They can interview on weekends. They could retake their interview if they didn't do well. And this is what we found. This is our stats. And so we've done 2,000 Carrot phone screens, which has saved 1,500 hours in engineering hours from actually calling people and interviewing. It allows us to actually expand the top of the funnel and do many, many more interviews than we would have before. And when you look at that, that's 187 days of engineering time saved, right? And so this is an example of just being very maniacal about that recruiting funnel and just understanding how it's doing and how do you make adjustments to it. So that's an example of the funnel. And finally, when we talk about hiring, I just want to touch on the importance of inclusion and diversity as you grow and scale your hiring, because it's really important that if you don't focus on it, you can actually lose that completely. And for us at Pinterest, it's really important because we're trying to build a very inclusive product. And to do that, you need to have an inclusive team. And so this is an example of a screenshot. We built skin tone filtering on search, and we wouldn't have done this actually. We wouldn't even come up with this idea if we didn't have a very diverse and inclusive team. So in 2014, Pinterest was one of the first tech companies to publicly set diversity goals. So we wrote on our blog and we said, hey, this is January 1st. By December 31st, we're going to commit to hiring this many folks from underrepresented backgrounds. And what this does is it really opens up the door for folks from underrepresented backgrounds, but it also just broadens our candidate pool dramatically. It allows us to reach a whole new audience of folks that we wouldn't have reached through traditional recruiting methods. And so, a lot of you might be asking, well, that's awesome that you did that. Well, what am I going to do? I didn't do that in the beginning. I screwed that up. But if we're all being honest, I think we all could have probably done a better job from the beginning. And so going forward, we just have to all be purposeful and make this an effort. And what we found is that by setting very public goals where we're holding ourselves accountable in the public, it actually forces us to align around that and hit that goal year over year. Okay, so tip number 2, identifying key talent and focusing on career development. This is really important because we just talked about hiring. Now, how do you retain those people and continue to get them to grow? So key question is how do you identify talent? So for us, what we've lent ourselves to is we built a in-house talent segmentation framework. So what we do is we actually look at each and every engineer and we ask ourselves a series of questions. So we ask ourselves, are they industry-leading talent? How are they doing relative to their peers? How are they doing relative to industry? We factor in things like, hey, are they a single point of failure? What does their growth potential look like? And this really helps us understand how each person's performing and what their potential looks like for the future. And then we pick actions targeted towards that audience. And so you would do something totally different to retain somebody that's a single point of failure versus somebody that has a ton of potential in front of them versus somebody that's industry-leading talent. And so we take different actions based on how we segment our talent. Switching gears a tad bit, but on career development, when we were early on, we launched, and I think probably a lot of folks in this room are familiar with engineering levels, so we introduced levels to the company. I think we were about 100 people at the time, and the goal here was to help people understand career progression and what good looks like, right? So we spent a lot of time wordsmithing out a engineering expectations framework by each level, and to give people examples. And I'm going to share my personal opinion here, which is very controversial. But to me, I think this was a giant waste of time for us, actually, as a 100-person company. And because what we saw was that people immediately shifted to thinking about what level they were. They didn't care about the work. They were just like, hey, am I L6? And when you're a kid, you don't think about, hey, one day I want to be engineer level 6 at Pinterest. You think about the impact that you want to have on the world, right? You think about, hey, I want to do this. I want to spend my time doing something I really love. And so, my tip is that I think it's much more important to focus on career development versus a level framework that is supposed to signify career development. And what I mean by that is really understanding each individual's career aspirations, understanding where they want to be in 3 to 5 years, and then really showing them each and every day how their work helps them get there, how their work actually ladders up to that end goal. And what you'll find when you really dig in, nobody wants to be put in a matrix of engineering level expectations. They have bigger goals and aspirations. And I think it's our job as leaders and managers to really understand those and help push those people towards that. So if your team's a lot larger, maybe levels is the right thing to do, but for us at Pinterest, when we were 100 people, I think it was a little bit premature. It takes a ton of work to create, maintain, and uphold those levels. So that's one thing that we learned. Okay, tip number 3, thoughtfully scale management. Another mistake we made really early on, I think this is a very common mistake when I talk to many startups, is that we went through this very quick growth period early on, right? Grew tremendously. And, there's this natural feeling when you grow so quickly early on that there's a period in time where you have to go out to the market and hire these professional managers to come in and manage the team because they don't know what they're doing. They were just like building code and they don't know how to run a team. And so we went out, we hired a bunch of experienced folks, we brought them in, and we integrated them in teams, we found them leadership roles, and in so many ways, in almost every single case, it almost turned out like organ rejection, where you put them in and then something would go wrong and it wouldn't be successful. And it also drove away some of our best internal leaders because they felt like they didn't have an opportunity to actually lead. And I think a lot of this goes back to the fact of building credibility at a new company is very difficult, especially when it's growing quickly. So over the past few years, we've been trying to answer this age-old question, internal versus external, what's better? Done a lot of analysis, benchmarking. And what we found is that on average, mostly the most successful managers that are at Pinterest have been promoted internally from within. And so, maybe we suck at external hiring. Maybe that's the thing. But I think it's largely due to the fact I said earlier is the context, the institutional knowledge is really important. And so the thing I want to just say is, I don't want to say hiring people externally is a terrible idea. I think you got to use it where it's needed, and helping you see around corners is a big thing of bringing in people that have seen growth. Okay, and then finally on this, the thing I want to say is just change is the most important thing. Being cognizant that change is a good thing, and making people feel accepted if they move from an IC role to a management role. There's just natural ceilings as you're growing, and people are going to hit a ceiling, and it should be okay for them to transition back to an IC role or into management, and making that feel okay is a really important thing. So here's a good quote from Michael Jordan on that. Okay. So these are the lessons. I'm just going to keep going in the sake of time because we're running low. So the second piece is evolving how you work. And this is a little bit more abstract because it's very dependent on your team and your company. But so my tip number 4 is repeat communication and verify comprehension. And so when you're really tiny, it's super easy to communicate with each other. You just grab somebody, you go up to a board, you write something down. There's no Slack, there's no email, there's no meetings. When you're slightly bigger, you've got to get in a room and discuss it. There's probably a meeting you need to schedule. And as you grow larger, keeping that communication is harder. You've got to continually broadcast over and over again. You have more process. And so at Pinterest, we started this thing early on. I thought it worked really well. We just created an email alias called Notes@, where anyone can subscribe to this email address, and it's almost like an open door policy. So if you have a meeting that's important, you send an email to Notes@ summarizing what happened. You can subscribe to it. You could filter. It's a great way to keep the company connected. And nothing really beats repetition. You've got to repeat the message over and over again in various different ways. And what I do is I actually poke and prod people, and I say, like, hey, how'd that go? How'd that meeting go? What'd you take away from it? So you actually learn what they took away, and you can actually adjust your messaging. And for us, repetition, the thing that we started was we started doing, like many other companies, Friday Q&As. So every Friday, the entire team gets around, we grab some beer, we talk about issues, no one's afraid to ask a question, and it's a great place to really reinforce messaging. And so every Friday, we start with the mission and the values of the company or something important that's top of mind, and it builds that drumbeat of repetition. Okay. Second to last thing, establish core values early on and reinforce every day. For companies that are growing really quickly, it's super easy to have your culture and values be influenced by who you're hiring. It's just so natural. And when you ask people at a larger company how many people have been hired in the last year, you'll see actually a huge portion of folks have just joined. And those are folks that could really influence the culture of your company. So early on, we established 4 key values, and these are values that we wanted people to embody, every single person. And so Ben, our CEO and co-founder, actually interviewed every single person early on in the company to screen for culture. He screened that if they use the product, and he also made a judgment call of, do they embody the values? Do I see this person embodying the values today and in the future? And so today, we continue to do culture interviews as part of the interview process, and we make sure that each and every person we're hiring actually meets our cultural values. And I think as you grow and scale, it's very easy to hire people and actually say, hey, actually culturally they weren't that great, but they meet the technical bar. But over time, that's going to really erode your culture and not lead to people that are aligned to the same mission you have. Okay. And then my final tip, which I think is the most important thing when you're thinking about hypergrowth, is keep your process appropriate to scale. And I think as leaders and managers, it's so important that we do this right, because when done well, it can really make teams efficient. And when done wrong, it can cause roadblocks and a lot of hurdles. And so I just want to use this example of Tesla. Love that company, but I'm just going to use this example. When they were producing the Model 3, they immediately went to this amazing idea of, let's automate everything. Every single robot should build the car. There should be no humans involved. And you hit a button, car will spit out from point A to point B. It'll be completely built. Really cool, right? And it's awesome in the long run because it'll allow them to produce cars by the minute. But what they found is that it's very, very hard to do. And it's almost like the process that you need when you're way further ahead. And so now if you go to their Fremont facility, they actually set up physical tents outside, and they're hand assembling cars because they couldn't get the robots to work that well. But it's an example of introducing the right level of process at the scale that you're at. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind when we think about software engineering, introducing the right development process, the right bug tracking process. And when your team is small and nimble, it's better not to force these things. It's better to see what happens organically. And then as you kind of scale, start to standardize those processes across your teams. Forcing standardization early on actually has a lot of negative effects. It generally slows things down and causes a bit of rejection from the team. So we've done that for bug tracking, for sprint planning, for goal setting, kind of organically built up and then standardized across the company. And with process, like the only thing that's constant and permanent is change. And so knowing that whatever you set today, you're going to have to revisit in 3 to 6 months is just something you should go in knowing and embracing. And so these are the lessons from this section, repeat communication, verify comprehension, establish key values and reinforce them, and keep process appropriate to scale. So that's all I had. Any questions?
We have time for 2 quick questions. If you outsource interviews, does the candidate miss out on meeting their would-be coworkers and thus self-evaluating the culture fit?
Yes, so it's a great question. That was actually my number one concern when I heard the idea proposed to me. But what we do is we only do it for phone screens. So today we generally do a technical phone screen assessment, which allows us to screen if that candidate meets like the technical bar or not. And then when they come on site, they get to meet the team, evaluate the culture, and those types of things.
Thank you. Second question: how do you verify comprehension of what you're repeating around values and culture?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's simple things like we randomly will ask somebody like, hey, like what'd you think about that meeting? Like, what are your takeaways from it? And you can hear by what they repeat back, what they actually intook. But also I think that the ultimate test is just observing how people are operating in meetings. So with our values, there's often meetings where people will say like, hey, we need to knit, or we need to they'll actually use the value in a sentence. And I think that's the biggest takeaway when like what you've been talking about has really landed when they're using it in their vocabulary.
Wonderful. One more round of applause for Naveen Gavini.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.